very pleased to welcome Stewart Jackson. Stewart was a Conservative Member of Parliament in the UK from 2005 to 2017.
Correct.
During which time he also served as a special advisor to the Secretary of State for Brexit, David Davis. So he was at the heart of the Brexit negotiations very early on. So we hope that he'll be able to tell us a bit more about that. So over to you, Stuart. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it's great to be with you. And I don't intend to speak for an hour because that would be extremely boring for you all. But I'm going to talk for maybe less than half of that. And I'd be interested in your questions. As you know, from the introduction, I was a Conservative Member of Parliament for 12 years. I actually was a special advisor just after leaving Parliament. And I also then went on to become a strategic advisor for Crosby Textor, who are the organisation, the business that helped David Cameron win in 2015 in the general election and Scott Morrison in 2019 in the Australian general election, and was a very strong supporter and still is of Boris Johnson in his mayoral bid in London in 2008 and 2012. You'll have heard of the aphorism of Chou En-lai in 1978 when asked what were the implications of the French Revolution, and he said it's too early to tell. And I think it's fair to say that you could take a similar view of the implications of Brexit in terms of the impact, not just in the United Kingdom, but the European Union as a whole. And I am going to unashamedly talk through the prism of a supporter of Brexit. I want to explain why Brexit happened, and I want to try and talk about how Brexit might affect trends in the policy and governance of the European Union. Now, it's hard to believe, but the United Kingdom at one time was a very strong member of the European Union, or before that, the European Economic Community, and before that, the Common Market. And the reason it was that there was a consensus in British politics that in the mid-70s, certainly, that the United Kingdom could no longer stand on its feet as a medium-sized geopolitical actor, as what was then seen as a declining nation, that the power blocks forming in the world needed the UK to join one of them, that it was not sustainable in the post-imperial Commonwealth era for it to remain as a major player. And therefore the power blocks were the United States, the Soviet Union and its acolytes, and of course the Far East, particularly Japan, which was a fast-growing nation then. And you have to understand that in the 1970s, the United Kingdom was in a terrible state politically and economically. And the term, the orderly management of decline, was used to describe what the prospects were of the United Kingdom. We had 27% interest rates. We had huge rates of inflation. We had industrial strife. We had a very split society between capital and labour. And the European Union, or the Common Market at that time, seemed to be an antidote to that. In the post-war period, we saw ourselves as a aloof, rainy, failing offshore island. And Europe was the future, young, progressive, where the sun always shone, where industry was powerful, the German economic miracle was there to see, and it was seen to be the future. And therefore, people even like Margaret Thatcher in the 1970s and well into the 1980s were still broadly supportive of the European project. But for the UK, it was always a transactional, mercantilist project. It was always about what we could benefit in trade. There was never an idea that we would allow significant proportions of our democratic national sovereignty to accrue to a European project. And it was only really the Delors years between 1985 to the early 90s that the European project was begun to be seen by British right of centre political participants, and particularly the Conservative Party, as a threat to national sovereignty. And of course, the seminal moment came in 1988 with the Bruges speech, Margaret Thatcher's Bruges speech, which pushed back against the increasingly integrationist, federalist approach of the European Union. And of course, we see federalist, we use the word in British politics, federalist, in a different way. We see it as a strong centre around which other countries move, whereas in Europe, the term federalist is a much more nuanced term in terms of the balance of sovereignty between individual sovereign states and the European Union as a centre. So the Conservative Party in the 1980s was a broadly pro-European party, and the Labour Party was a broadly anti-European Union party. And that is a cultural thing as well as a political issue, because, of course, the last time the United Kingdom was invaded by foreign forces was in the 17th century. We do not have, because of having been an island, we do not have a folklore of bloodshed, of war on our own soil. And therefore, we have a different perspective to many European countries. If you think about it, Europe has been the fulcrum of violence and conflict in the last 200 years to an almost unique degree in the world. The Germans have invaded France 3 times in the last 150 years. The evil tyranny of the Nazis was within a few generations, a lifetime ago. And countries such as Greece, Portugal, Spain, Italy have lived under fascist regimes. And therefore, there will be a cultural difference, because for many people, it is a rational decision, if you live in Central Europe in the 70s and 80s, to believe that a supranational entity would guarantee your civil rights, your human rights, your economic prosperity, your family's well-being better than your own country could. And that's not a noble view to take. Germany is probably the best example. The reason so many Germans have taken Brexit so badly and have seen it as a personal affront to them, to their self-image as a liberal, open, globalist, cosmopolitan nation, is because for them, the EU has always been a redemptive project to make amends, to obviate the thoughts of their own history, which has been so grisly and gruesome. And I'm not ascribing any current German politicians to any view that wasn't the case. But Germans do see the EU as a means for the greater good, not just of Germany, but for other countries in the European Union. Although there is some cynicism in Britain about that, because by some strange coincidence, the priorities of the European Union always seem to exactly match the priorities of Germany. But you would expect that as a big and important, powerful economic entity. So Britain left the European Union not just for political reasons and not just for cultural reasons, but a mixture of two. And in the short term, it's certainly the case that Brexit happened because of a Tory civil war, a civil war within the Conservative Party between the globalists, the liberals, the mercantilists, and those who concentrated much more on sovereignty, on national self-determination and the importance of a parliament. And if you think in wider terms, the impact was significant and still is significant. 19.4 billion euro in 2016 prices was the contribution, the second largest net contributor to the European Union. So in financial terms, it will have an impact on the multi-year financial framework of 21-27, the lack of the UK being in the European Union. There's been an ideological shift as well. And I'll talk a bit about that later. But clearly the UK had a role as a small L liberal, free trade, progressive, low tax, low regulation, supporting member of the European Union. And it's left a big gap in that role now. And in geopolitical terms and diplomatic terms, the UK is and was a major global player and an asset to the EU. And the reason that the UK could never be written off outside the European Union is that English is the world's language of choice. The UK is in the right time zone. It has a stable political system. It has a much respected legal and judicial regime, and for many other reasons as well. So it does have that diplomatic reach. It has soft power. I think it's regularly voted the first or second biggest soft power in the world. And on things like the permanent seat of the UN Security Council, NATO membership, and just in defense expenditure, one of the largest countries in the world for defense expenditure and the purchase of defense equipment. And of course, that all came to an end with the independence referendum that took place on the 23rd of June 2016. And I must reiterate again, it was not about, what happened was not about chauvinism, xenophobia, and immigration. Now, immigration clearly was a short-term impact. The 2015 immigration crisis arising from the Libyan civil war, and most particularly the Syrian civil war, clearly had an impact on the minds of many, many people in the UK. They looked at Schengen, the operation of Schengen. They looked at free movement. They looked at the substantial numbers of people that had come to the UK between 2004 and 2015 as a result of free movement. And they were fearful that continuing waves of immigration would place huge burdens on the public sector and taxpayers in the United Kingdom. But it's not true that immigration was per se a problem in the UK. It was uncontrolled immigration. I think it's important to make that point clearly. The UK too, I think, was disappointed at the failure of the EU, not for the first time, to read the runes, to read the room in the negotiations that David Cameron undertook, principally with Angela Merkel and the EU in the early part of 2016. And I think people will choose to write PhD theses for many years as to what would have happened if the European Union had been prepared in January and February of 2016 to offer some flexibility in the interpretation of the single market in terms of free movement. I think that the United Kingdom would have voted, the electorate would have voted to remain in the EU had that happened, but it didn't. So the United Kingdom has now left the European Union fully as of the 1st of January 2021. And we are in a sticky period of political divorce. It's important to realise from the beginning that the European Union has always taken an unsentimental and hard approach to Brexit. I don't believe, and I think senior figures in the European Union don't believe, that any further countries will choose to leave the European Union in any time soon, for the reasons that I will enunciate shortly. But they do nevertheless take the view that they should develop two strategic objectives around Brexit. And Martin Selmayr, who was Chief of Staff to the Commission President up to 2 years ago, made these points many years ago. And the way the EU has behaved over the Northern Ireland Protocol of the Trade and Cooperation Treaty demonstrate this. And the two strategic objectives that the EU have is that they want to make and wanted to make Brexit as difficult, as painful for the United Kingdom as possible, in order to prevent other countries seeing it as a feasible objective for themselves. Now, there are movements across Europe for exiting the European Union, but they are not in any way as powerful as those that were in the United Kingdom prior to 2016 from about 2005. And it's fair to say Selmayr has achieved his goal, because Brexit was a hideous, tortuous process. And having lived through the Article 50 negotiations between 2017 and 2018, I can tell you that it was extremely difficult. And it was difficult for a number of reasons. The EU chose to make it difficult because of their adherence to a very solid, robust negotiating stance. And to be fair, they were very united because they were required to give not much away. For Northern Ireland, not many countries cared that passionately about Northern Ireland. For citizens' rights, they were united because they all wanted to defend their citizens' rights in the UK. And of course, the money, they were keen for the European Union to squeeze as much money out of the United Kingdom in the process. So they could be disengaged in that process. On the UK side, it was much more chaotic. You had a weak leader in Theresa May, you had a hung parliament with no majority, and you had a very significant proportion of the UK establishment, the media, the civil service, the universities, big business, the charity sector, who thought Brexit was a catastrophic mistake and that the British people should learn the lesson of this and vote again in a referendum. So Selmayr was right, it was chaotic, and he gambled, I think, that other countries would not see the benefit of leaving, and I think he's broadly been proven right. But the other one is really, the other strategic objective is probably of more interest to us, and it's this, that the other strategic objective is to undermine the UK's competitive advantage post-Brexit. And that really lies behind the policy decisions of the European Union, because they can see that a liberalised, deregulated, dynamic UK economy, which already, despite Brexit, has managed to attract the second highest level of foreign direct investment in Europe, just behind France in the last year, that will be a threat, not an existential threat to the European Union, but a threat to the economic prospects and prosperity of the European Union. And I think that goes to the big question, will we be rivals or will we be partners? And I think that is the question that is unanswered at present. Not to say that the EU doesn't have regional splits later. But if you think about it, the EU suffers from demographics. It has an increasingly older population. It has an increasing propensity to regulate, to increase regulations, to increase government involvement in business and commerce. It has a lower birth rate. It has an immigration crisis, which it has still not sorted properly from 2015. And it has periodic financial crises, the worst of it being, of course, recently, the Eurozone crisis in 2015. And if there was anything which changed the minds of many of the political classes about the European Union, it was the EU's handling of Greece in the Eurozone crisis of 2015. the fiscal waterboarding of the Troika on the Greek people, and to a certain extent, the Irish, the Portuguese, and the Spanish was seen as a complete repudiation and a betrayal of the founding principles of the European Union, effectively for the benefit of only one or two of the significant countries in the European Union. And it's that that dirigism, that regulation, and a rules-based regime, and a failure to be pragmatic and practical in the pursuance of politics, together with a drive, a ratcheting up of integration, which remain the problems behind which the European Union still grapples with now. And you see it in the way Greece was treated. You see it with the wider Eurozone crisis. You see it in the standoff between the German Constitutional Court and the EU Commission on the bailout fund. You see it, of course, most recently in the vaccine crisis. And to give you an example of how that can work against the interests of the people of Europe and the European Union as a political entity, one only needs to look at the recent institutional framework negotiations with Switzerland. And as you know, the Swiss have always been very independently minded and always been reluctant to commit themselves too much to an integrationist project like the European Union. And as you all know, they didn't join when invited the European Economic Area in 1992. And of course, they struck 120 separate, discrete bilateral deals with the European Union over the last 10 or 12 years, to the great irritation of the European Union, because the European Union doesn't like to work on a bilateral basis. It likes to work on a cohesive, centralizing basis. And the talks broke down, of course, in May, and we're now in a slightly odd situation of trying to understand whether it was wise of the European Union to pick a fight with what is regarded as Europe's per capita wealthiest and most successful country. And as you may know, the talks broke down over wage protections, state aid rules, and the free movement of EU citizens and their access to welfare benefits in Switzerland. And it's a microcosm of the mistakes they made with the UK, because they've picked a fight with two of the most successful economies in the European on the European continent, Switzerland and the United Kingdom. And the reason I use Switzerland as an example is that you have these qualities, these attributes of the collective political consensus of the European Union making decisions which have backfired, in my opinion. For all that, the EU is unlikely to break up or implode anytime soon, notwithstanding what I said about the demographics of the European Union. And it's also worth saying that most economic projections see the proportion in dollar denomination of trade that the EU does with the whole world falling significantly. I think in 2002, it was 30% of the entire world trade was done with the EU in dollar denominations. It's now about, I think, 22%, and it will fall under 20% within the next 10 years. So 4 in every $5 are not being traded through the European Union. And the other issue, even the EU accepts that, because a projection made, I think, in the last year or so, even the European Commission estimates that most economic growth in the world, the vast bulk of it, I think 90%, will take place outside the European Union. So you have problems of inflexibility, demography. You also have a democratic deficit. And I do think that's important. When you have an advanced modern liberal democracy or democracies in Europe, the electors are not stupid. They can see that there is a democratic deficit. British voters vote for a parliament that they can get rid of. British voters vote for effectively regional parliaments, the Scottish Parliament, Northern Ireland Assembly and the Welsh Assembly. All of those parliaments can make laws. The European Parliament cannot make laws. It is a rubber stamp body. And I do think that unless the European Union Parliament really flexes its muscles and pushes back against the accretion of power to the Commission and the Council of Ministers, you will always have that democratic deficit. And that's why you've seen progressively since 1979 a reduction in the turnout in European Union parliamentary elections to quite significantly low figures where you don't have compulsory voting, because people will not vote for a body that A, they can't feel any affinity with, and B, they don't feel affects their life in any way. Now, you may take issue with that, but that is a perception, I think. So the idea that the EU will implode or split, I don't think is borne out by any real evidence. I think the threat to the European Union post-Brexit, for the reasons I'll talk about, is that it may be eclipsed into irrelevance, or it will overstep the mark with significant geopolitical missteps. You could say, for instance, that signing the EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, the CAI, just before the Biden administration took power was an example of a geopolitical misstep and hubris by the European Union. And I would think that is a proper summary. It was a foolish thing to do given the pushback towards China on things like human rights, on intellectual property theft, on flexing its muscles in the South China Sea. There was an example where the EU thought of itself as a bigger geopolitical player than it is, and irritated and annoyed the incoming US administration. We could also debate, of course, the relations between the German government and Russia on Nord Stream 2, whether that is an appropriate and sensible geopolitical decision of the German government with the support of the EU, or most of the EU, with the Biden administration being extremely apprehensive about that. And that brings us really to the position of the UK vis-a-vis the European Union. Again, the question, partner or rival. Yesterday, the independent report on innovation, growth and regulatory reform was produced in the UK for the UK government. Now, why is that important? It's important because it draws a dividing line post-Brexit on regulations and innovation and growth policy between the United Kingdom and the European Union. And of course, the European Union has fixated on some areas of policy where it has been out of date, not innovated, not been open to debate and discussion in a number of areas. And I think the question, when you think of these particular commercial areas where the UK is seeking to deregulate, is who's going to have a competitive advantage? Will the UK disprove Selmayr that the EU, for all its efforts, will not prevent the UK becoming a rival rather than a strategic partner? Now, one of the myths is that the UK government believes that we should all become like Singapore, that we should have very low taxes, very low regulations, we should cut environmental standards, labour standards, and that kind of thing. And of course, that we should put significant amounts of public money into some industries in order to distort the pan-European market. That is not the case. There are no senior figures in the Conservative Party who've ever argued that we should do that. But the key issue is we should have the capacity to make the decision to do it if we so choose. But that is not the same. So the questions are, the sectors are in the report yesterday, are important sectors because they're areas where the EU is not as competitive as its member states and populations expect it to be. On financial services, the UK will remain a superpower on financial services, and deregulation of superpowers cannot be anything but good for the United Kingdom with its competitive advantage. Green energy is another key area of deregulation and divergence from EU centralised policy. Digital health, data. Now, data is an obsession with the EU. GDPR is an obsession, having a centralised data policy and those irritating cookies that pop up that you have to press a button to get rid of the cookies. Well, you know, the big question in the world is, are cookies that important? Who loves cookies? No one. They're irritating. And as someone said the other day, when you want to get to the information, of course you're going to press accept cookies because you want to get to the information on your website. But they're completely, they're a great example of gold plating over regulation. Data is a key area where the UK could become extremely competitive. Agricultural genomics. There is a predisposition in the EU against genetically modified food. And I don't understand why that is. For a political entity which is committed to alleviating poverty and hunger in the third world, to set your face against any innovation in GM foods seems to be odd. Satellite technology, artificial intelligence, nutraceuticals and consumer health and clinical trials. These are all really, really important areas where the UK can develop a competitive advantage. And I think the European public know this. Gradually, and of course, they've seen the results of the vaccine rollout, which has been quite a seismic moment in the relationship between the voting public in the EU and the European Commission and their own governments. They've seen that and they have concluded that the EU could do better. And if you look at the Allensbach Institute polling in April, it found that only 21% of Germans have a lot or some degree of confidence in the European Union Commission. 50% of them had some or a lot of confidence in their own German government. Now, that's in Germany, the most pro-EU country, I would say, in the whole of the European Union. A country which is well known not just for prosperity and economic success, but continuity and stability and consensus in its political makeup. And you may think to yourself, well, Germany, okay, they're a bit fed up with the vaccine rollout, and they're a bit fed up with Merkel. Who isn't? I mean, she's been around for 16 years, and you know, she's like the relative you can't get rid of at the end of the party. You know, she's finally going in September, and it will be a new beginning for Germany to have a new chancellor. But for the first time ever in German history, a party is now committed to German exit from the European Union. Now, it is Alternative for Deutschland. It is not a mainstream party. It is a party which other German parties have committed to not working with and not putting into any form of government. And the position, the Dexit position, has been pushed on Alternative for Deutschland by radicals within that party. I would just say to you that UKIP took a similar view over 20 years ago And people ridiculed UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party, and said it was so out of the mainstream, so right-wing and extreme, it would never influence British people to leave the European Union. And look what happened. Because UKIP was able to gain power as a lightning rod for those people in the United Kingdom who were not liberal, who were not globalist, who did not believe necessarily in the free market, who were economically left-wing but culturally right-wing. Now, Germany is not in the same position. Germany has a different relationship with the European Union, but nevertheless, it could happen in 10, 15 years' time. It may be impossible to lock out Alternative for Deutschland from government. They're now polling at 10 or 11%. If they poll at 15, 17%, they will nevertheless be influential in German governance. So what are the trends in the EU in more detail? There's always been, of course, a drive to reform the EU, but of course it means something different to different people. I think the COVID crisis has brought to the fore the key questions about what reform means in the European Union. We have effectively developed in the EU a de facto single economic policy because of COVID. We now have the dispersal of 750 billion euros worth of grants and loans for COVID relief. And as ever with the European Union Commission, that has strings attached. I'm not talking about law and governance with Poland and Hungary. I'm talking about other economic, monetary and fiscal policy pronouncements by the European Union. And as always, things that are seen as temporary become permanent. In the UK, of course, the best example of that is income tax, which was considered to be temporary in the 18th century, and 250 years later, we still all pay income tax. So don't be surprised if the changes demanded by the European Union Commission as a result of the dispersal of the grants and loans on COVID relief become effectively a central financial as well as a monetary policy. And of course, the healthcare crisis has made the EU think very carefully about the development of a central EU-wide public policy suite. Hitherto, like tax, public policy has been a prerequisite of, or the bailiwick of the constituent countries, individual countries. Now the EU is thinking that it might be better to have an EU public policy for public health. And the Green Deal, the EU's 30-year Green Deal up to 2050. There was a time when energy policy was only really studied by nerds and really boring people with no friends. No one was really interested in energy. Now energy is central to the economy of the whole of the European Union and central to discussion and debate around climate change. And therefore, a decision by the EU to make energy policy a centralising EU-wide competence is incredibly important. And why is that? Because ultimately it will be the EU that decides how green the energy is in Malta, in Portugal, in Greece, in France, how much nuclear power should be allowed, how much wind power should be subsidised, etc., etc. That is quite a big move of sovereignty between the constituent member states of the EU and the EU centrally. It's what the economists called a couple of months ago integration by stealth. Each of these individual policy areas becoming the competence of the EU. And it's what President Macron described as, quote, a European Renaissance, unquote. That's how he sees the challenges for his view on further integration of and centralisation of EU powers post-Brexit. He sees Brexit as an opportunity. Now we've got rid of the awkward relative. Now we've got rid of the person that blocks all the good ideas. For him, the French national interest is served by what he calls strategic autonomy, which I'll talk about in a minute, which is more integration and more centralisation. And obviously, the relationship between France and Germany has always been massively important, and in fact is the most important relationship. Germany has never wanted to lead the EU per se, and France has always wanted to lead, but has been able to do so, and sees its secondary facility, its imperative, as being holding Germany to account and holding back the instincts of Germany to grow, essentially restraining German hegemony. Other countries, though, are not bought into the French vision, and there will always be a north-south divide between the Nordic and Baltic states and the southern profligates. The north has felt the exit by the United Kingdom more acutely than the south, at least politically rather than economically, because like the UK, they believed in fiscal discipline, in internationalism. They were economic liberals. They were free traders. They believed in low regulation and tax. And the best thing about the UK for countries like the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, was that they were bad cop. They were not afraid, the UK were not afraid to take on the EU, to cause trouble, to push back on this integration. And these countries could hide behind the UK. And now there's a huge gap because the UK is gone. When I went to the Netherlands to speak to the Dutch Foreign Minister with David Davis, they very much took the view, we're very sad that Big Brother's left because he looked out for us, to which David Davis said, well, you should have done more to keep us on board if you were that bothered. But that speaks to a worldview which unfortunately has a much less powerful resonance in the EU now the UK has left. They, of course, are very dubious and suspicious of Macron's push towards more centralised power, more protectionism, more protectionist policies on trade, on state aid, and more acutely on protecting agricultural subsidies. And they're just generally sceptical of French integrationist moves. And that's why, for instance, they teamed up with the Austrians during the multi-year financial framework discussions in 2021-27. The next big group, of course, is the Visegrad group of Central European countries, and they have a different view. They were particularly concerned about the plight of their migrant workers in the United Kingdom. And they were very keen to make sure that there was a proper surveillance authority to look after the rights of their citizens once the EU left the UK left the European Union. And I think it's fair to say they achieved that. There were 800,000 Polish people, or were in 2020, in the United Kingdom, 86,000 Hungarians, several hundred thousand Latvians and Lithuanians. In fact, in Lithuania, in the 10 years after 2004, 28% of the population of Lithuania left the country. 28%. Now you imagine, in the United Kingdom, that would be something like 14 or 15 million people just leaving to go to another country. Half of them went to the United Kingdom. Significant number went to Spain and other countries. So they're concerned about that. And of course, they were concerned about the economic impact of Brexit on their country, on the remittances from successful workers in the UK, and other issues as well. They also fear a multi-speed Europe, which puts them more in the French category of supporting the French, because they see multi-speed as the rich, powerful countries like Germany and France and the Netherlands streaking ahead and leaving them behind. And they are in favour of continuing protection of agriculture and a fiscal union. And for them, a fiscal union means more money in their coffers. And then you have what I call Club Med, which are the so-called profligate Southern European countries. And of course, the UK was very important for them pre-Brexit and remains important in terms of tourism and leisure, airlines and other related industries. The oldest ally that the UK has had in the world is Portugal. The Treaty of Windsor, which I think was signed in 1386. Portugal is a massively supportive country of the United Kingdom. And it just shows that the ties are very close. And of course with Spain as well, and Italy. There is a big Italian diaspora in the UK still. And of course, they felt the impact of the UK's contributions disappearing, and they fear cuts in the cohesion fund, and they are in favour of integration because they see integration again as a guarantee and insurance policy that their financial welfare will be at the centre of European policy making. So the fact that the UK has left and Brexit has happened, in all, shows that there is still a big hole in the EU project. It's not to say that the EU will fall apart, because it won't, but it will give rise to regional blocs and new alliances, and for example, competition law reform. So just to wrap up, where are we now? We have a number of issues still unresolved. The Northern Ireland Protocol, unresolved issues around mutual recognition in financial services, fishing disputes around state aid, and potentially citizens' rights. There will be no big leap forward in integration, but there will be attempts at fiscal reform and areas like public health policy. And the new German Chancellor, I think, will be an important and integral part in solving these issues. Fundamentally, as the Carnegie Institute put it, the EU is weak as a diplomatic actor as a consequence of dysfunctional decision-making, a lack of common strategic culture, and internal divisions. So my conclusion is, Brexit is a long-term project which happened because of culture as well as politics. The EU institutions will be in conflict permanently with member states and internally. We have not yet decided whether we are rivals or partners and what strategic autonomy really means for the United States, for NATO, and for the relationship with the United Kingdom. But I would suggest the indicators are we are likely to be at least economically rivals, and that both the UK and the EU will prosper, but at different levels. That's pretty comprehensive. I'm being asked by Robert to go to questions, which I'm delighted to, because I'm fed up with the sound of my own voice. So, Robert, are you going to chair?
Yeah, I'll move the microphone around.
Well, first, Stuart, thank you for taking the time to talk with us. You talked about the democratic deficit in the European Union, and I was wondering that if you feel like it has something to do with the European Union having a decrease of intergovernmentalism in exchange of a rise of supranationalism.
So are you asking about supranationalism and national parliaments?
Yes.
Yeah, I think this is as I said at the beginning, this is a cultural as well as a political issue, in that there's much more of a willingness in continental Europe to accept the need for collaboration and cooperation between different countries and the pooling of sovereignty. If you look at a country like Belgium, it's a very diverse country with different traditions, different languages. You could say the same about Spain. Germany is more unified and coherent now. But remember, all European countries have been very small, disaggregated entities with different culture, different languages, different histories over many, many years. And therefore, it does have a different position. Now, that's not to say the UK is a coherent whole. Obviously, we have a debate going on about the potential for a second Scottish independence referendum. I don't think there will be one anytime soon. I don't think it would be won by the Scottish National Party. And I certainly don't think Scotland would be admitted very quickly into the European Union because of the Spanish veto. But I do think, yes, there is a difference. The challenge for the EU is to try and understand that there will always be a growing trend for centralisation, but equally there is a repulsive trend, a repelling trend by national groups to exert more national sovereignty as well, and that comes to the fore in times of crises, as we've seen in the immigration crisis, the vaccine crisis, and that is a continuing trend. Those two sort of polar forces of nationalism and centralisation. One feeds off the other. Next question. Yeah.
I hope I'm not touching a sensitive topic, but I was wondering about Gibraltar and the referendum it had on Brexit and how Gibraltar refused Brexit and had to go with it anyways. How does it affect the whole trade with the European Union? How is the status of Gibraltar affecting also the integrity or impacting the UK after Brexit?
On Gibraltar?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, I think that's a very interesting question, which I don't really know the answer to, because I think it was always our position when we were negotiating under Article 50 that Gibraltar was a separate entity. The territorial sovereignty of Gibraltar was separate and should not really be wrapped up in a multilateral, multi-nation trade and cooperation agreement. And I do think that what we saw about a year ago, obviously, is a much more pragmatic approach by the Spanish government and the UK government to allow trade and commerce between mainland Spain and Gibraltar. But there will not ever be a time when a UK government unilaterally decides to revoke the sovereignty of Gibraltar. So that it's about the degree to which Spain and the Spanish government wants to expend political capital on fighting over Gibraltar, as against all the other interests that Spain has in welcoming British tourists. I've got friends and neighbours who've been to Spain in the last few months, and they've been shocked by the impact of the effective ban on travel in large parts of Andalusia and other parts of Spain by the fact that Germans and particularly British people aren't coming. I hope that the sort of rapprochement with the Spanish government over Gibraltar and the practical approach continues, because we have much more to gain from having a good, close relationship with Spain, which is a wonderful country, than arguing about Gibraltar. I know that's the politician's answer, but I think that's where we are at the moment.
Thank you very much. And my question is, can you give us a recommendation to the EU member states in order to protect national sovereignty?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the lesson of Brexit is that the evolving relationship with the European Union can actually serve as a catalyst for enhancing the autonomy and authority of national parliaments. I think the lesson of the British Parliament over the period from about 1979 to about 1999, 20 years, was that there was a tendency to kind of outsource scrutiny and oversight of European Union issues to small committees, to civil servants, and that members of Parliament were not properly engaged in overseeing the impact that the European Union directives and regulations had on their constituents. And I think that's important to ratchet back that national parliaments should be properly holding the EU to account, because if the EU is going to take more and more power on public policy for healthcare policy, on energy, on transport, on EASA, airline safety, these decisions have to be properly scrutinised, and it's an opportunity for national parliaments to reclaim some of that prestige and authority, I would say. But there will, as I made the point, there will always be competing blocks within the European Union, and therefore a sensible government in Denmark, in Portugal, or in Austria will be thinking ahead of which blocks they need to be part of in order to effect the change they want. And so both government and national legislatures have important roles to play in holding the EU responsible.
First of all, thank you very much for this comprehensive presentation. I think that you touched all the points that were important to us. I would like just to maybe ask another question on financial services and why this issue was never on the table of negotiation. We know that financial services are very important for UK, and actually the Brexit agreement mainly focused on goods. So was it a national decision or strategy of the UK government, or another decision maybe had an impact on that? Thank you.
I think the politics meant it was too complex an issue and too sensitive for both sides to expedite a solution. It was easier because both sides did want to secure an agreement by the end of the transition period on December the 31st, 2020. They could not fully study and enunciate their policies and settle as an agreement on financial services. It was easier to leave it in abeyance with the expectation. The realistic expectation is that the EU will not grant equivalence to the United Kingdom for the service industries, but particularly financial services throughout the European Union single market. And I think that's baked in to the projections. Remember, in 2016, there was some really crazy figures going around that branch offices of significant investment banks would soak up, 50 to 100,000 British financial services jobs in Frankfurt and Paris, in Dublin, and that hasn't happened. It's not nothing, but it's well south of 10,000, if that. And I think the UK remains a very significant player in financial services. So I think this is going to be an example, which I haven't talked about many of the examples, of constant negotiation, Swiss style, over financial services. And I just hope there is a degree of sensible pragmatism on both sides, because it's access to capital is at the very heart of successful capitalism and business and commerce, and therefore the EU should not be too doctrinaire, and the UK should be as practical and pragmatic as it can be on this. But in answer to your question, it was not possible. It was too complex an area to settle that part of the TCA by the end of 2020.
Any final questions? Yep.
My question is not related to the
Brexit because I got all the answers from the lecture. But if there is no other question connected to Brexit, I would like to ask what do you think about Hungary's role in the EU in the past 11 years?
I think that's a live hand grenade chucked at me as the final question, I think. It probably goes to the heart of the conundrum and the debates in the EU about a rules-based regime and how much national identity and culture and political heritage is allowed within the EU project. And I think Hungary is in a very difficult position now. It relies on the largesse of the EU financially to move from being a second world country to being a first world country in its post-communist iteration. And therefore it is somewhat constrained. But on areas like judicial reform and immigration, it is absolutely at loggerheads with the EU in terms of culture and policy. So I think the EU would be very foolish to push Hungary too hard. Things might change when Orban is no longer the leader of Hungary and Prime Minister. Things may change, but I can't see Hungary leaving the EU, but I can't see it having anything other than a very difficult and fractious relationship with the EU over the next 5 or 10 years.
Well, with that, Stuart Jackson, thank you very much.
Thank you. And I am sorry I went over time. It was so interesting, some of the points that needed to be made, but thank you for your hospitality and have a great rest of the conference. Thank you.